The late afternoon light poured gently through the lace curtains, soft and golden, casting slow-moving patterns across the hardwood floor. Norfolk was beginning to thaw after a long, gray winter, and the faint smell of blooming magnolia drifted in through the cracked kitchen window. Rachel Bennett stood at the counter, chopping vegetables for dinner, humming an old jazz tune under her breath. Friday evenings were usually her favorite, quiet, predictable, the kind of domestic rhythm she'd once prayed for. But when her phone buzzed, everything about that peace shifted, almost imperceptibly. "Hey, sweetheart," Ryan's voice came through, smooth and casual, the kind of tone he used when he was about to soften bad news. "Listen, something came up at work. They're sending me on a quick trip down to Myrtle Beach. Some client thing. I'll only be gone a couple of days." Rachel froze with the knife still in her hand. She glanced toward the dining table, already set for 2 candles, plates, and a bottle of wine breathing quietly beside the glasses. "Oh," she said softly, trying to sound understanding. "That's sudden. You didn't mention anything about a trip earlier." "Yeah, it's last minute," he replied, the sound of traffic in the background. "You know how corporate gets when the quarter's ending. I'll make it up to you, okay? Maybe a weekend away when I get back." She forced a smile he couldn't see. "Sure. Drive safe." When the call ended, Rachel stood still for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and continued cooking. Her movements were calm, almost deliberate, but her mind was no longer in the kitchen. By the time Ryan got home, the air smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary. He kissed her cheek lightly and said, "You spoil me," with that half-smile that had once made her feel chosen. Tonight, it only made her tired. They sat down to eat, and though the conversation flowed easily, small talk about work, neighbors, the new students in her literature class, something beneath the surface had changed. Rachel caught herself studying him the way she might analyze a passage from one of her novels. Every pause, every glance, every word carried subtext. His laugh felt slightly too rehearsed. His eyes shifted away too quickly when she met them. And when he said, "You're the best thing that ever happened to me," she wanted to believe it, but something in her chest whispered otherwise. After dinner, Ryan opened a bottle of red wine and put on music, Frank Sinatra, their usual Friday night soundtrack. He pulled her into a slow dance right there in the kitchen, his hand warm at her back, his cologne familiar. For a fleeting second, she wanted to let herself sink into it, to pretend nothing had changed. But as his chin rested against her hair, her gaze drifted over his shoulder to the half-packed suitcase on the couch. Later, while he showered, Rachel began helping him pack. She folded his shirts, rolled his ties, and tucked his shaving kit neatly into the side pocket. He stepped out, toweling his hair, saying, "You're too good to me." She smiled faintly and replied, "Someone has to make sure you don't forget your socks." He laughed and turned away to grab something from the closet. That's when the briefcase fell open. A thin folder and a few receipts slid out onto the carpet, followed by 2 plane tickets. Rachel bent to gather them automatically until her eyes caught the print. Myrtle Beach. Saturday morning. 2 passengers. For a moment, everything went still. The air left the room. Her hands trembled as she turned the tickets over, reading the names again and again, Ryan Bennett, and the second field was blank, unprinted, waiting. A companion ticket. Her heart pounded, so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Everything okay?" Ryan's voice called from the bathroom. Rachel slipped the tickets back inside the briefcase and snapped it shut, her breath shaky but controlled. "Yes," she said evenly, her voice somehow steady. "Just making sure you didn't forget anything." He emerged, dressed now, smiling as if nothing in the world were wrong. He zipped up the bag, kissed her forehead, and said, "I'll call you when I land, okay?" She nodded, forcing a small smile. "Of course." when he left. She stood by the window, watching the taillights disappear into the misty Virginia dusk. The street was quiet except for the chirping of early crickets and the faint rumble of a distant train. She crossed her arms over her chest, feeling the slow rise of dread crawl up her spine. Her mind tried to find excuses, colleagues, business partners, some administrative mix-up. But her intuition, sharp and persistent, whispered the truth she didn't want to name. Something was wrong. And this time, it wouldn't be something she could ignore. That night, sleep was impossible. Rachel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while the clock ticked toward midnight. Each sound, the creak of the old house, the hum of the refrigerator, felt too loud in the silence Ryan left behind. She replayed the moment with the plane tickets over and over in her head, convincing herself she might have misunderstood. Maybe it was a client's assistant, maybe he'd bought 2 seats for comfort, maybe anything except what her gut already knew. At 1 a.m., she gave up pretending. She slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to Ryan's office. The air smelled faintly of his cologne and printer ink. She turned on the desk lamp, its soft yellow light spilling across the papers. His laptop was gone, but his phone bill lay under a stack of invoices. She didn't consider it snooping, she called it surviving. Scrolling through the recent statements, one line caught her eye, a hotel reservation confirmation from Ocean View Resort, Myrtle Beach. The entry showed 2 guests. 2. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the words until they blurred, the reality of it pressing down like a weight she could no longer deny. Rachel sank into the leather chair, her hands gripping the armrests. Her entire world, the classes she taught, the dinners she planned, the laughter she had tried to keep alive, felt suddenly hollow. How long had it been like this? How many times had she believed a lie because love had made her blind? By 3 a.m., she was still sitting there, her body numb but her mind spinning. She could confront him, demand answers, but she knew Ryan. He'd talk circles around her, twist guilt into apology, and somehow make her feel like the unreasonable one. He'd done it before. Quietly, calmly, Rachel decided she needed something stronger than words. She needed truth she could see with her own eyes. At dawn, she brewed coffee she didn't drink. The sunlight bled through the window blinds, pale and hesitant. She dressed automatically, cardigan, jeans, her teaching tote slung over her shoulder, then sat at the table, staring into the cup. The steam had already gone cold when she finally reached for her phone and called the school. Mrs. Patterson? It's Rachel. I need to take a few days off. Family matter. Her principal's voice was kind, even concerned. Of course, Rachel. Take whatever time you need. You've earned it. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they made her throat tighten. She thanked her, hung up, and exhaled shakily. By 8, she was in her classroom, gathering papers from her desk. The smell of chalk and paper filled the room, familiar and grounding. Students' essays lay in neat stacks, some brilliant, some barely readable, but for once, she couldn't bring herself to care about misplaced commas or sloppy metaphors. Rachel. The voice came from the doorway. Claire Hughes stood there, coffee in one hand, concern written all over her face. They'd been friends since grad school. 2 young teachers who'd shared lesson plans, heartbreaks, and late-night grading marathons. Rachel forced a weak smile. Hey, you're here early. Don't hey me, Claire said, closing the door. You look like you've been up all night. What happened? For a moment, Rachel hesitated, but Claire's steady gaze was impossible to hide from. So she told her everything, the call, the tickets, the hotel. Each word cracked something open inside her. When she finished, Claire set the coffee down and crossed her arms. So he's in Myrtle Beach, and you're here, torturing yourself with what-ifs? No, Rach. You go there. You find out. You deserve to see the truth instead of letting him script it for you. Rachel's voice shook. And what if it destroys me? Claire stepped closer, her tone soft but firm. Then you'll rebuild. But at least it'll be with the truth, not with lies. The bell rang in the hallway, students laughing, lockers slamming, life moving forward as if her own hadn't stopped. Rachel nodded slowly, the decision solidifying in her chest like a stone sinking to the bottom of calm water. By noon she was home again. The suitcase Ryan had packed still sat in the corner. She opened her closet and reached for her own. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. As she folded clothes, she caught her reflection in the mirror, pale, tired but resolute. When she finished, she looked down at her hand. The gold wedding band gleamed faintly under the morning light. She slid it off and placed it gently on the dresser, next to a framed photo of their wedding day, two people smiling beneath a canopy of magnolia blossoms. She zipped her suitcase shut, whatever waited in Myrtle Beach. It would no longer be hidden behind pretty words or practiced smiles. The air at Norfolk International Airport smelled faintly of brewed coffee and jet fuel, that sterile mixture of anticipation and exhaustion that hung over every terminal. Rachel moved through security like someone underwater, her mind distant, her body on autopilot. She'd bought the ticket only hours earlier, telling herself she just needed to clear her head. But every step closer to the gate made that lie harder to believe. She sat by the window, clutching her boarding pass, watching planes lift off into the hazy Virginia sky. The announcement for her flight came over the speaker, a calm female voice that made it sound like something ordinary. Nothing about this felt ordinary. She boarded last, sliding quietly into her assigned seat halfway down the aisle. A man occupied the window seat beside her, mid-40s, neatly dressed in a gray jacket, dark hair threaded with early silver. He was reading through a folder of papers with a red legal tab sticking out. When Rachel sat down, he looked up briefly, offered a polite smile, and said, "Afternoon." She nodded, fastening her seatbelt. "Afternoon." For the first 15 minutes, they sat in silence as the plane taxied and then climbed through a blanket of white clouds. Rachel closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. The seatbelt sign chimed off. She reached for the magazine in front of her, pretending to read, but the words blurred together. "Rough day?" the man beside her asked quietly. His voice was calm, low, the kind that could steady an entire room. She hesitated, unsure if she wanted to talk, then said, "You could say that." He closed his folder and set it on the tray table. "Business or personal trip?" Rachel's lips curved into a polite, practiced smile. "Visiting friends." "You?" "Work," he replied. "I'm a journalist, investigative mostly." He paused, as if gauging whether she'd be comfortable hearing more. "I'm based in Charleston, but I'm following up on a case down south. Corporate fraud, paper trails, fake contracts, offshore accounts, the kind of thing that looks boring until it ruins people's lives." Rachel turned toward him, slightly. "That sounds heavy." He shrugged lightly. "Truth usually is." Their eyes met for a brief second, and Rachel felt something shift, a flicker of connection, not romantic but human. She wanted to ask more, to stay in this neutral conversation that didn't involve deceit or heartbreak. Instead, she said, "I teach literature. In Norfolk." "Ah, a storyteller," he said with a half smile. "That explains the calm." She let out a quiet laugh. "Calm isn't exactly what I'm feeling right now." The plane hit a sudden pocket of turbulence. The cabin rattled. A few passengers gasped. Rachel gripped the armrest, her knuckles whitening. Without hesitation, the man extended his hand. "It's all right," he said softly. For a moment, instinct overrode pride. She took his hand. His skin was warm, steady grounding. She stared at their joined hands. Two strangers holding on because the world above the clouds was shaking and something inside her loosened. When the plane steadied again, she released his hand quickly, embarrassed. Sorry, she murmured. He shook his head. No need. Happens to everyone. They both laughed quietly, and the tension between them melted into something lighter. For the rest of the flight, they spoke in small fragments. He told her his name was Andrew Carter, that he'd been a journalist for almost 20 years, chasing truth even when it made enemies. She told him about her students, her love for poetry, how teaching sometimes felt like breathing life into forgotten voices. She didn't mention Ryan, or the real reason she was on this plane. Some truths were too raw to say aloud. As they began their descent, the sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the cabin in gold. Below them, Myrtle Beach stretched out like a postcard, blue water, long piers, and distant rooftops glinting in the light. Andrew closed his folder and tucked it into his briefcase. Looks like a good place to start over, he said half to himself. Rachel glanced out the window, her chest tightening. Maybe. When the plane landed and the seatbelt sign chimed off, she stood to collect her bag. Andrew reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a simple, white business card. Andrew Carter, Investigative Journalism, Charleston Gazette. In case you ever need help, he said, his tone gentle, almost knowing. Rachel took it, her fingers brushing his. Thank you. He smiled, a small, kind smile, and stepped aside to let her pass. As she walked through the terminal, blending into the stream of travelers, she slipped the card into her purse without a second thought. But something about his words lingered, echoing in the back of her mind. In case you ever need help. She didn't know it yet, but before this trip ended, she would. The warm salt air hit her the moment she stepped out of the cab, carrying with it the distant rhythm of waves breaking against the shore. Myrtle Beach was everything Norfolk wasn't, louder, brighter, soaked in sunlight and laughter. The Ocean View Hotel gleamed ahead, its white facade reflecting the late afternoon sun. Couples in linen clothes wheeled suitcases across the marble entrance. Children ran past, dragging inflatable dolphins. Rachel hesitated for a moment on the curb, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles blanched. Inside, the lobby smelled of coconut lotion and freshly polished floors. Behind the reception desk stood a young man with a practiced smile, the kind of hospitality that came from repetition. Rachel slid her driver's license and credit card across the counter, trying to steady her voice. Reservation for Bennett. Rachel Bennett. He typed quickly, then said, Of course, Mrs. Bennett. You'll be on the 3rd floor, room 318. He smiled politely and handed her a key card. Her throat went dry. Sorry, could you check something for me? My husband, Ryan Bennett. He might have arrived earlier today. I just want to make sure he checked in safely. The clerk nodded, clicking through the system. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Bennett, room 222. The number hit like a blow to the chest. She forced a small, grateful smile, thanked him, and turned away before her expression could betray her. Room 318 faced the ocean. Through the glass balcony doors, Rachel could see the horizon stretching endlessly, the sky bleeding into gold and rose. She dropped her suitcase onto the bed and sank into the armchair, her heart pounding so violently it felt visible beneath her ribs. Every part of her screamed to storm down to room 222 and demand answers. But her rational mind, sharp, deliberate, whispered no. Not yet. She waited. Hours passed. She sat in the lobby with a magazine she never opened, watching the elevator doors, the revolving entrance, the blur of strangers coming and going. The clock behind the reception desk ticked past 5, then 6, then 7. Her coffee grew cold. Her palms stayed clammy. Then she saw him. Ryan walked through the glass doors, sunlight outlining his familiar silhouette. But he wasn't alone. A woman walked beside him, tall, slender, her dark hair tumbling down her shoulders in soft waves. She wore a white sundress that swayed with each confident step, and when she laughed, she leaned into Ryan's shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world. His hand rested at the small of her back, his expression easy, boyish, the same smile he once reserved for Rachel. The sight stole her breath. She couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The magazine slipped from her hands, landing soundlessly on the carpet. It was one thing to suspect, another to see. Lauren Collins. The name would mean nothing to her yet, but it would soon change everything. Rachel rose from her chair slowly, as if moving too fast might shatter what little remained of her composure. She turned toward the elevators and forced herself to walk calmly to her room. Once inside, she locked the door, pressed her back against it, and slid down to the floor. The tears came without sound, hot, relentless. She pressed her palms against her face, trying to catch her breath, but the sobs kept breaking through. She thought of their wedding, of the vows whispered under magnolia trees, of every night she'd believed he was hers alone. When she finally managed to speak, it wasn't to him. It was to the only person she trusted. She grabbed her phone and called Claire. "Rachel? What's wrong?" Her voice cracked. "It's true." For a few seconds, there was only silence on the other end. Then Claire's soft, furious whisper, "That bastard. You need to leave, Rachel. Pack your things and come home." Rachel wiped her eyes, her breathing uneven. "Not yet." "Not yet? Rach, what more proof do you need?" "I need to know everything," she said quietly. "Every lie, every detail. I don't want to run this time. I want to see it." Claire sighed, defeated but understanding. "Then promise me you'll be careful." "I will." She hung up and sat there for a while, the phone heavy in her hand. The sun had set, leaving behind only the muted hum of the ocean and the faint echo of laughter from the boardwalk. Rachel stepped out onto the balcony. The sea breeze caught her hair, cool and sharp against her tear-streaked cheeks. Below, the beach stretched empty under the night sky, waves rolling in like breaths against the sand. She kicked off her shoes and walked down barefoot, the cold sand grounding her. Under the moonlight, she stared at the horizon, the endless, indifferent ocean that had swallowed countless secrets before hers. The tide came in and brushed against her toes. Somewhere in that sound, she heard the last thread of her marriage snap. No words, no confrontation, just the hollow, private silence of something that had finally died. Morning arrived, quietly, though the ocean outside Rachel's window still roared as if mocking the calm. She hadn't slept much, only dozed in short bursts between waves of disbelief and anger. The image of Ryan's hand resting on that woman's back replayed endlessly in her mind. Each time, her chest tightened like she was being pulled under. She showered, dressed, and left the hotel without a plan. The boardwalk stretched before her, sun-washed and already alive with the sound of seagulls and the smell of coffee and sea salt. She followed the rhythm of footsteps and laughter until she found a small cafe tucked between souvenir shops. Its windows were fogged from the morning rush, and the words Harbor Cafe were hand-painted in fading blue letters. She stepped inside, mostly to escape her thoughts. The place was warm and smelled of espresso and sugar, and that's when she saw him, Andrew Carter, sitting near the window, typing something on his laptop. He noticed her almost immediately. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, surprised but smiling, standing slightly. "Or can I call you Rachel?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Andrew, what are the odds?" "Small world," he said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "Please join me? You look like you could use a cup of coffee." Normally, she would have declined, but something about his steady presence felt like the first real breath she'd taken since yesterday. She nodded and sat down. He signaled the waitress. "2 coffees, please. Black for me. And for you." "Just the same," she said, forcing a smile. Her hands wrapped around the mug when it came, soaking in its warmth. "You don't look like someone on vacation," Andrew said gently, his tone observational, not prying. Rachel laughed quietly, the sound brittle. That obvious. Let's just say, journalists notice things. She hesitated, then sighed. I came here because I thought my husband was on a business trip. Turns out he's not. Andrew leaned back, slightly, eyes soft but intent. I see. He's here, she continued, her voice tightening, with another woman. He didn't interrupt. He didn't reach for empty comfort. He simply listened. And that was enough for her to keep talking. She told him about the phone bill, the tickets, the hotel lobby. By the time she finished, her throat ached and her coffee had gone cold. When she finally looked up, Andrew was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You said his name was Ryan Bennett? Yes. He opened his laptop again, scrolling through a few documents, his brows furrowed slightly. That's strange. What is? I'm investigating a logistics company tied to a fraud case. Shell firms, fake invoices, stolen assets, the usual mess. The company's name is Collins Freight Solutions. It's owned by a woman named Lauren Collins. Rachel froze. The name sliced through her like a blade. Lauren Collins. Yes. Why? She swallowed hard, the color draining from her face. That's her. The woman I saw with him. I heard the clerk say her name last night when they checked in. Lauren Collins. Andrew sat up straight, his calm demeanor shifting to focused alertness. You're certain? Positive. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Well, that changes things. Rachel's pulse quickened. You mean he's involved? Possibly, Andrew said carefully. If your husband's with her, it's not just an affair, it's a partnership. And not the kind they put in wedding vows. She pressed a hand to her forehead, the cafe spinning for a moment. So he's lying to me and breaking the law. Andrew's voice softened again. It looks that way. But listen, this isn't your burden to carry. I'll handle the investigation. You don't need to put yourself at risk. I don't want revenge, she said, her voice shaking. I just want the truth. Then you'll have it, he said firmly. But Rachel, you need to promise me you'll be careful. People who hide money don't like it when someone finds it. She managed a faint smile. You sound like someone who's learned that the hard way. He chuckled under his breath, more than once. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the cafe filling the space between them, cups clinking, the hiss of the espresso machine, waves crashing faintly in the distance. When they finally stood to leave, Andrew handed her his card again, though she still had it tucked inside her purse. If anything happens, anything at all, you call me. I will, she said. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, and the boardwalk shimmered in the light. Rachel walked toward the beach, her mind a storm of disbelief and fury. The truth was worse than she had feared, but somehow clearer. Her husband hadn't just betrayed her heart. He had built his lies on stolen ground. The next 2 days passed in a strange rhythm, half surreal, half electric. Rachel hadn't planned on being part of anything like this. Tailing her husband, taking photos, whispering strategy with a journalist in a parked car. Yet there she was, sitting beside Andrew Carter in a borrowed sedan on a humid South Carolina afternoon, staring at the entrance of a waterfront restaurant where Ryan and Lauren had just gone inside. Andrew's camera rested between them, a small black device that looked harmless but could destroy lives when used right. They'll meet someone, he murmured, adjusting the focus. They always do before a transfer or new contract signing. The goal is to look legitimate, clients, investors, middlemen. But the money never lands where it's supposed to. Rachel leaned back against the seat, her nerves humming. You've done this before. He smiled faintly without looking away. More times than I'd like to admit. Inside the restaurant's large glass windows, Ryan appeared relaxed, laughing, his hand occasionally brushing against Lauren's arm. Rachel's stomach turned at how effortless his charm still looked, how well practiced. She'd once loved that smile. Now it looked like a weapon. A moment later, two men approached their table. Both wore press suits and that sheen of false confidence that came with people who lived off deception. Andrew lifted the camera and clicked once, twice, then again when Ryan passed an envelope across the table. "There," Andrew whispered. "That's not dinner conversation." Rachel stared, her pulse quickening. "Who are they?" "One's a contractor from Savannah, fake on paper. The other's listed as a logistics consultant, but his company doesn't even exist. They move money through offshore shells, bill clients for phantom shipments, and disappear before the paperwork catches up." Her hands curled into fists. "And Ryan's part of it." "More than part of it," Andrew said quietly. "He's their link to new investors. The clean face. The good husband with a respectable job." Rachel let out a shaky breath and turned her gaze back to the restaurant. Ryan was still smiling, still pretending to be the man she'd fallen in love with. But now she saw the hollowness behind it, the greed, the ease with which he lived a double life. When they finally left the restaurant, Andrew started the car. They followed at a safe distance as Ryan and Lauren drove back toward the hotel. The sun had begun to set, spilling a copper glow over the streets, the kind of light that made everything look beautiful, even betrayal. In the hotel parking lot, Ryan opened the car door for Lauren, kissed her hand, and laughed at something she said. Rachel's chest tightened, but she didn't look away this time. She raised her phone and took a picture. The sound of the shutter was soft, but it echoed through her like a verdict. When Ryan and Lauren disappeared inside, Andrew turned to her. "You didn't have to do that." "I did," she said simply. "I need to see it with my own eyes. I need proof, not just for you, or the police, but for me. So I'll stop asking myself what I did wrong." For the first time, Andrew didn't argue. He just nodded, as if he understood exactly what it meant to need closure in tangible form. Later that night, they sat on the beach with paper cups of coffee gone cold. The boardwalk lights shimmered behind them, but here on the sand it was quiet except for the tide and the wind. Rachel drew her knees to her chest. "You know, I thought I'd feel better after seeing it all, but I just feel empty." Andrew's gaze stayed on the horizon. Emptiness is what comes after denial. It means you've stopped lying to yourself. It's where justice begins. She looked at him, skeptical but curious. "Justice? For him? Or for me?" "For both," he said. "Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about clarity, about naming things for what they are. Lies, greed, betrayal, and truth, no matter how small, is where it all starts." The ocean wind tugged at her hair, cold and sharp, but for the first time in days, her breathing steadied. She watched the moonlight ripple across the water and whispered, almost to herself, "He's not just a cheater. He's a criminal." Andrew glanced at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "That's the first step," saying it out loud. Rachel closed her eyes, letting the salt air sting her face. The grief hadn't disappeared. It simply changed shape, shifting into something quieter, stronger. For the first time since the briefcase, she didn't feel powerless. Beside her, Andrew sipped his coffee and said softly, "Truth has its own kind of gravity. It pulls everything toward it eventually, even people like him." And under the silver light of the Carolina moon, Rachel began to believe he was right. 3 weeks later, the name Ryan Bennett was no longer just a husband's name. It was a headline. Rachel saw it first over breakfast. She had been grading papers in her kitchen when the news alert lit up her phone screen. "Charleston journalist exposes corporate fraud ring tied to Virginia financial consultant." Beneath it, a familiar photo, Ryan smiling in his company headshot, standing beside Lauren Collins, CEO of Collins Freight Solutions. Her coffee went cold in her hand. The article was written by Andrew Carter. His words were precise, calm, devastating. He laid out the scheme in perfect order. Shell companies, forged invoices, falsified shipping documents, laundered funds through offshore accounts, all linked to Ryan and Lauren's logistics firm. There was no embellishment, no sensationalism, just evidence. Cold, thorough, irrefutable. By noon, federal agents had arrived at Ryan's office in Norfolk. Within 24 hours, he and Lauren were in custody, charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud and embezzlement. Rachel didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She simply sat at her kitchen table, reading Andrew's article again and again, until the words blurred into a strange kind of closure. When the preliminary hearing was announced in Richmond, she went. She didn't tell Claire. She didn't tell Andrew. She just drove herself, steady and silent, to the courthouse where her marriage would officially end. Not by divorce papers, but by judgment. The courtroom was cold, the air heavy with whispers from reporters and the rustle of paperwork. Rachel sat quietly in the second row, wearing a simple navy dress, the same color she had worn to Ryan's company banquet 2 years earlier, when he'd introduced her to clients as the love of my life. The irony wasn't lost on her. When the doors opened and Ryan was led in wearing a county-issued suit, the room fell silent. He looked thinner, unshaven, but still carried that same old arrogance, the confidence of a man who thought charm could bend the world to his will. When his eyes finally found hers, he stopped mid-step. For a long second, neither moved. Then Rachel blinked once and turned her gaze to the floor. She didn't look at him again. The judge read through the charges, the evidence, and the guilty plea his lawyer had negotiated. Lauren sat beside him, composed but pale, her designer calm, cracking only when the sentence was spoken. 2 years in state prison for each. Ryan's jaw tightened. He tried to speak to the judge, to the lawyers, to Rachel, but the bailiff motioned him forward. He turned once more in her direction, perhaps expecting tears or forgiveness or even anger. But all he met was the steady, indifferent face of the woman he had destroyed and who had survived him. When the hearing ended, Rachel waited until the room emptied. She walked out through the courthouse steps into the pale, winter sunlight. The noise of reporters echoed nearby, microphones, cameras, questions, but she didn't stop. At the corner, a homeless man sat by the curb, holding a paper cup. His face was weathered, eyes tired but kind. Rachel paused, reaching for something, anything to give him. But then her fingers brushed the cool metal of her wedding band. She slipped it off. The gold glinted once in the sunlight before falling into the cup with a soft clink. The man blinked up at her, surprised. "Ma'am, are you sure?" Rachel's voice was steady. "That's all he's worth now." A reporter nearby caught the gesture, her camera clicking rapidly. Within hours, the image spread online, Rachel standing tall in her navy dress, the courthouse behind her, the ring gleaming in the cup. It became a symbol of quiet defiance, shared under headlines she never meant to inspire. That evening, Andrew called. "You were incredible today," he said, his voice low. "I didn't do anything," she replied. "You did everything," he said. "You showed what strength looks like when it stops explaining itself." 2 days later, Andrew's follow-up piece appeared in print, "The Woman Who Chose Dignity." It wasn't about scandal or betrayal. It was about resilience, about the quiet grace of a woman who'd faced humiliation and instead of collapsing, had simply let go. Rachel read it once, then folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer. She didn't need to keep it as proof. The justice she wanted had already unfolded, not in Ryan's sentence, but in her own calm. Outside, the evening breeze carried the faint sound of church bells. Rachel stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on, and thought not of the man who'd been taken away, but of the life that had finally come back to her. The days that followed felt strangely ordinary. like life had quietly resumed while Rachel was still catching up to it. Norfolk had returned to its usual rhythm, the morning hum of cars outside, students chattering as they crossed the school courtyard, the smell of chalk and coffee blending in the teacher's lounge. Rachel slipped back into her routine with the quiet precision of someone who'd been shattered and carefully rebuilt. She graded essays about the Great Gatsby and its illusions of love and wealth, smiled at her students, and walked home each afternoon beneath the pale bloom of early spring. The city seemed softer now, not because it had changed, but because she had. At home, her small house by the river had become a sanctuary. The same living room where she once waited for Ryan's calls now held only the soft rustle of pages and the faint ticking of the old wall clock. Every evening, she brewed a cup of jasmine tea, sat by the window, and watched the sun sink behind the bridge. The ache was still there, sharp on some nights, dull on others, but it no longer defined her. It simply existed, like a scar that no longer hurt but still remembered. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, angled, confident. Ryan. She stood for a long time before opening it. The words inside were venom disguised as remorse. He blamed her for everything, for talking to Andrew, for betraying his trust, for letting the media destroy his life. He wrote about sleepless nights, broken promises, and how she'd turned into someone cold. By the time she finished reading, her hands were trembling, not from sadness, but disbelief. The man who had stolen, lied, and cheated still saw himself as the victim. Rachel folded the letter neatly, set it on her desk, and stared at it for a moment. Then she took out a blank page and began to write. Not a reply, not even words meant for him. It was her final confession, written to herself. A farewell to every version of the woman who had waited, doubted, forgave. When she was done, she walked out to the backyard, struck a match, and watched the flame catch. The paper curled slowly, glowing orange before turning to ash. The smoke rose into the evening air, dissolving into the faint hum of crickets and river wind. She whispered goodbye, not to Ryan, but to the ghost of their life. The next day, Claire stopped by, as she often did, carrying pastries and unsolicited advice. "You're different," she said, eyeing Rachel with that mixture of curiosity and pride that only close friends could manage. "You look peaceful." Rachel smiled softly. "I'm getting there." "Getting there." Claire laughed. "Honey, you're already there. You're glowing. You even stopped checking your phone every 5 minutes." Rachel rolled her eyes. "That's because no one's texting me anymore." Claire grinned, sipping her tea. "Good. Then maybe the right one finally will." That evening, as twilight fell over the river, Rachel's phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Rachel Bennett. The voice was warm, familiar. She felt her breath catch. "Andrew." "Guilty," he said lightly. "I'm back in town. Thought I'd see if you'd let me buy you dinner. Not for work, not for a story. Just dinner." For a second, she said nothing. The sound of his voice brought back flashes. The wind on the beach, the quiet understanding between them, the way Truth had felt safe in his presence. "Dinner," she repeated softly, her lips curving into something genuine. "That sounds nice. Tomorrow, 7? 7's perfect." When she hung up, she realized she was smiling, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep, somewhere healed. Outside, the first stars appeared above the river. Rachel stood by the window, her reflection framed in the glass. For the first time in a long while, the silence around her didn't feel empty. It felt like possibility. Months later, the world looked different to Rachel. Not because it had changed, but because she finally had the strength to see it clearly. By the time spring reached the Carolina coast, she found herself driving south to Charleston, her small suitcase in the back seat, the ocean air drifting in through the open window. and Drew had invited her to visit for weeks. No deadlines, he had said over the phone, his voice half teasing. Just fresh air, good food, and maybe some peace. It had taken her time to say yes, not because she doubted him, but because she was learning to trust the idea of happiness again. His home sat near the edge of the marshlands, a white two-story cottage with blue shutters and jasmine vines climbing the porch railings. The air was warm, scented with salt and gardenia. As she stepped from the car, he appeared at the door, smiling in that easy, grounded way that had first calmed her on the plane months ago. "Welcome to Charleston, Mrs. Literature Teacher," he said, holding out a bouquet of white roses. She blinked, surprised. "You remembered." He tilted his head. "How could I forget? You told me once you used to keep them on your windowsill, back when you were still waiting for someone who didn't deserve you." Rachel laughed softly, her throat tightening with emotion. "And now?" "Now," he said, "you get to keep them because they're yours, not because you're waiting." Inside, the house was filled with light and the faint scent of coffee and paper. Stacks of notebooks, newspaper drafts, and old photographs lined the wooden desk by the window. He'd been working on something new. She could tell from the restless energy in the air. "You're writing again," she said, running a finger along a stack of pages. He nodded. "A book this time. Not about fraud or crime. About truth and what comes after. About people who lose everything and still find a way to start again." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "You inspired it, actually." She smiled, trying to hide how deeply those words reached her. "Then I hope you end it well." He chuckled. "Oh, I plan to." The next few days unfolded gently. Morning walks by the pier, late lunches at small cafes, quiet evenings on the porch listening to cicadas hum. There was no rush, no expectation, no performance. Sometimes they talked for hours. Other times they just sat in silence, letting the world breathe around them. Rachel realized that the peace she felt with Andrew wasn't born of passion or escape. It was something steadier, truer. He didn't try to fix her pain. He simply gave it room to heal. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the water, painting the marsh in gold, Andrew poured 2 glasses of wine and joined her outside. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "All the time. But for once, it doesn't scare me." He studied her for a long moment, then set his glass down. "Good, because I've been thinking about that too." A year later, beneath the same magnolia trees near the waterfront, he knelt and asked her to marry him. The world seemed to pause, the wind holding its breath, the petals drifting like snow. Rachel said yes without hesitation, her voice trembling with joy and disbelief. Their wedding was small, just a handful of friends, sunlight filtering through the branches, a soft piano playing somewhere nearby. Claire cried, of course. Andrew looked at her as if he'd waited his whole life to do so. As they danced under the magnolias, Rachel rested her head against his shoulder and felt, for the first time, a love that didn't demand proof or apology. It wasn't the kind of love that tried to erase the past. It honored it, learned from it, and grew beyond it. And in that golden hour, with laughter and music floating on the breeze, Rachel understood something simple and profound. Love, when true, isn't born from illusion. It's born from resilience. Charleston was bathed in the soft warmth of early spring again, the tender time when everything seemed to hum with quiet renewal. The magnolias had begun to bloom, their ivory petals drifting across the sidewalks like snow that didn't melt. Rachel had grown to love this rhythm, the sound of waves beyond the marshes, the echo of church bells, the way the morning sunlight painted their kitchen walls gold. But lately she had been tired. Not the kind of fatigue that coffee could fix, but something deeper, gentler, almost unfamiliar. She'd catch herself pausing mid-lesson, one hand pressed to her stomach as if her body were whispering something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. "Maybe it's just stress. she told Andrew one morning, brushing off his concern. End of semester, too many papers. He raised an eyebrow, amused. You? Stressed? The woman who survived federal courtrooms and headlines. She laughed, but her fingers trembled slightly as she poured tea. It's probably nothing. Still, he insisted she see a doctor, just to be sure. The clinic sat near the harbor, painted in soft shades of sea green, the kind of place where even bad news might sound gentle. Rachel sat in the waiting room, listening to the rhythmic tick of a wall clock, watching sunlight scatter through the blinds. She had been here before years ago in another city with another doctor who had said words that never stopped echoing. I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett. It's unlikely you'll ever carry a pregnancy. The memory clung to her like a shadow as she sat there, waiting. When the nurse called her name, her pulse quickened. The tests were simple, routine, the doctor said with an easy smile. But as the results printed and the doctor turned toward her, something in the woman's expression shifted from professional calm to soft wonder. Mrs. Hull, she said, using Rachel's married name now, I have some news. Good news. Rachel blinked, unsure what to expect. You're pregnant. The words landed like light, too bright, too pure to be real. For a second, she just stared, her mind unable to bridge the distance between disbelief and understanding. That's not possible, she whispered. They told me years ago. I know, the doctor said gently. But sometimes the body finds its own way. You're about 8 weeks along, and everything looks healthy. Rachel pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. It wasn't loud, the way she cried, just a quiet release, like something long dormant had finally exhaled. That evening, she told Andrew, he found her standing by the porch, staring out the marsh as if she were waiting for the world to confirm it again. When she turned to him, her eyes were wet, but her smile was radiant. Andrew, she said softly, we're going to have a baby. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he stepped closer, his face breaking into the kind of smile that could undo the hardest days. Rachel, he breathed, voice trembling. Are you sure? She nodded, laughing through tears. I saw the heartbeat. He reached for her hand, then for her face, pulling her into an embrace that felt like every prayer answered without words. You see, he whispered against her hair, life knows when to begin again. They stayed like that for a long time, the sky darkening, the cicadas beginning their song. For Rachel, it wasn't just joy, it was grace. After everything, after the betrayal, the courtrooms, the long silence of grief, life had bloomed again, not in defiance of pain, but because of it. Weeks later, when the sun rose pink over the Charleston pier, Rachel and Andrew walked hand in hand along the wooden planks. The morning breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine, and the ocean shimmered like glass beneath them. She paused for a moment, her free hand resting over her belly, feeling the faint flutter of the new heartbeat inside her. Andrew turned to her, eyes warm with wonder. What are you thinking? Rachel looked out over the endless horizon, her hair catching the light. I'm thinking, she said softly, that pain didn't break me. It planted something new. He squeezed her hand, and they stood there in silence as the sun lifted fully above the water, washing them both in gold. In that moment, the world felt weightless. There were no echoes of the past, no shadows left to haunt her. Only the sound of waves, the promise of a new beginning, and the quiet truth that some endings aren't endings at all. They're miracles in disguise.